Bam.
This is Erik Kleinsmith, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, we're doing something kind of fun here. So Erik and I, for those of you that don't know, Erik and I were in the Army together. He was my commander. He commanded a company of spies and interrogators, and we deployed to Bosnia. And sort of in support of an upcoming book talking about that deployment, Mike Guardia is writing it for like a history of Delta Company 165th. We thought we would sort of do a rundown of why we think that the Delta Company story during its deployment to the Bosnia-Herzegovina area in support of NATO's action, which was designed to, like, could we hold this peace that the Dayton Peace Accords granted? So I guess, Erik, the big question is you've got more oversight than I have on like why we were doing this, what happened, what led up to this. Can you give us a background and then some like some background before we deployed, and then like what our overall, like when the commander comes to you is like, Erik, I'm going to need you to do this impossible thing. And then you're going forward as commander and doing the job.
Yeah. Well, before I came to 165th, I actually joined the unit downrange. And so you guys deployed with under the command of Captain Paul Norwood. But the 3 years prior, I was stationed in Vilseck, Germany. I was the intelligence officer for 1st Battalion, 6th Infantry. And then I was the 3rd Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division intelligence officer. And all during that time, we were monitoring the Bosnian Civil War from start to finish. And so, even prior to PCS, my prior duty station in Colorado and Arizona, we were monitoring the war that started in essentially 91 with the Slovenia and followed by the Croatian separation from Yugoslavia, and then war breaking out almost immediately, primarily in Croatia. But the Bosnian Civil War was different because there was, in Croatia, there's the Serbians in Croatia were a very small minority, and in Slovenia they were almost completely Slovenian and Croatians that lived there. So it wasn't a big deal in terms of them, not a big deal, but it wasn't hard for them to declare their independence, except for the fighting that had taken place. But in Bosnia, you had a very intertwined mix of Croats, Serbs, and Muslims all together in the same country. And what made it worse is that it wasn't a homogeneous lines. There were enclaves that were independent and isolated from each other. And that's where you got, during the initial part of the war, you had those horrific sieges of Srebrenica and Gorazda, and some of these smaller towns that were isolated within the mountains that the Serbian militaries and paramilitary forces essentially just surrounded, besieged, and attacked. And Sarajevo wasn't any different. So the war finally tipped into the direction of an alliance between the Croats and the Bosniaks, or the Muslims, and the Croatians essentially invaded from Croatia to push out the Serbs, to continue their push of the Serbs that they had done in the late 1995, and that's really much the setting of the Dayton Peace Accords in a nutshell. Now there's a lot of horrific events. The war was complex in itself, but that was really our touch point. So we were monitoring this. In fact, when I was in 16th Infantry, one of our contingency missions was to perform an evacuation of the U.S. hospital that was positioned in Croatia during the height of the Civil War. That we had to go in there and pull them out. So it was our infantry battalion that was going to do that. If that was a requirement. And so we were doing rehearsals, we were doing exercises in case that ever happened. So that had me prepared for and monitoring everything that was going on in country before I joined the 165th to come down to, and essentially I was selected as the company commander prior to my even deploying in. So I deployed after you guys had been there for I think 3 months and worked. We were stationed, the battalion headquarters and the company headquarters were both stationed at a place called Lukovac, Bosnia, which was essentially a coal factory along the rail lines, where we were in our offices were in the scientific laboratories. There was beakers and all kinds of chemicals and residue. We were sleeping in these same rooms. But that was where we were located. And for the first 3 months, I worked for the battalion operations officer, and he was placing me on different tasks before I took command. So the first task that I did was to build a runway for a UAV or a drone called the Pioneer, and it was a Marine UAV company from California that they had deployed USMC-1 that we had to deploy. I had to build the runway for them with the engineers, select the site. So we were driving all around country and finally put this runway together. And once they moved in and set up their operations, one of the first drones they launched crashed into a nearby village house. So the next task was to make a luncheon for the locals and have them come out so that they're not pissed off at what we just did to one of their residences. So and there were some other operations. We had a hilltop operation. It was called just Hill 1326 or 1328. And I had to do an aerial resupply of that. And it was basically a listening post on top of the mountains. And you drive up there, and it was heavily mined. You could see how they had done, not only that the Bosniaks were there, but they also mined it. They took Claymore mines or the Warsaw Pact version of the Claymore mines, and to increase their potencies, you could see that they had tied them next to propane fuel tanks. So in case the mine itself wasn't deadly enough, they wanted the propane tank to explode as well and increase more casualties. So there was a lot of makeshift dangers everywhere we went. And that was one of the second big missions before I took command in August 5th of 1996.
Yeah. When you take command, one of the things we've talked about in the past is when you take command of a company of counterintelligence agents and interrogators on small teams, we're scattered to the winds. You know what? Let me back up because I want to make sure we cover some of the background. When we get the word, hey, we're going to be on like a lockdown, right? And for the audience, this just means that we're on like a 72-hour recall. Like, hey, don't be further than 3 days away or 24 hours a day. And we were working 7 days a week in training. You would think in this case that we would be training on what we were going to do. But what we were going to do was such an unknown for this because we had two jobs when we were in garrison. One was to do like red team, like look for weaknesses on camps all around Germany. And the other thing was to do background investigations for people and any kind of investigations, but background investigations for people that maybe had a clearance, that kind of thing. And then if anybody was doing anything weird, we would be the lead element to go and do an interview with this person to figure out what they were doing. The interrogators, I don't think they had any kind of mission other than just like learning their languages and that kind of thing because we weren't at war. So you had this company that was considered stractical, which meant we wore like suits and stuff when we were in garrison, but we also went to the field and practiced source meets. But we really weren't like our medal. There's a thing called a mission essential task list, and they give you like 500 tasks that you have to be able to perform at some level of function to be competent as a unit. And because we had these two totally different missions, you really couldn't train on all of it. And so we would go to the field and train somewhat on source operations, but not really. Like it wasn't like the nuts and the bolts. We were able to sit in front of someone, role play, and do this in like a Schaffenburg, Germany or somewhere. Right. So we did a little bit of that training. But we also did stuff on like military movements, driving in cold weather, surviving in cold weather, a lot of things. And then the unit would lose the training. They would say, oh, we can't find the list of everybody who went through the winter driving training, which is code for we don't know what to do today. So we have to be here. So everybody's going to watch this stupid video. Right. And so a lot of our time, it's hard to pre-deploy back then. Pre-deployment train counterintelligence people. And then, by the way, keep in mind, we're partnered with interrogators, which wasn't doctrine or, if this whole thing had happened a year later, nobody in the unit would have had a rifle. Most of the interrogators would have rotated back to other places and been other things, and it wouldn't have been possible to do this mission.
Right. Well, and that's, you got to think about the mission of the 165th. It was a military intelligence battalion at the corps level, which means that the battalion itself originally had 4 companies and 4 line companies. So you had an electronic warfare group that was deactivated some years earlier.
Mhm.
You had the long range surveillance guys, and they were there. So they went to Bosnia with us, and that was all airborne infantry. Their job in wartime is to do long range reconnaissance. They're paradropped or they maneuver far out ahead of U.S. forces and report and call on our field artillery, that kind of thing. And then the other company was the interrogation company, and the Army in their wisdom decided to deactivate that company in the middle of the deployment. And it was just a plan for the Army overall. It was
It was already in place.
Yeah, it was perceived as the peace dividend, since we're no longer fearful of the Soviets coming across the German border. We felt that we didn't have those threats. It was the 90s. We felt we could draw down a lot of our forces, and the interrogation company was one of them that was just on the chopping block, says, we're going to draw these guys down. Well, we're in the middle of a deployment. They decided to do that. And I still remember this ceremony, and the company commander was a guy named Alex Cochran, great guy, who had to roll up the guidon. All of his interrogators then got rolled into Delta Company. And so here you have a military intelligence force that is supposed to be training just like the infantry and the armor and the artillery battalions that were in country with us. They had trained for forever on how to do heavy combat operations. And this is one of the first instances where a heavy force was designated to do peacekeeping operations, which is a totally different thing that nobody really was proficiently trained in. And so there was a lot of trial and error and make up as you go. There was I was an observer controller for your validation exercise when they sent everybody to Grafenwehr, and that was kind of a rubber stamp to check the block. Yep, these guys are all validated for going into Bosnia, because what was kind of disconcerting. I was still a member of the 3rd Brigade as the intelligence officer. I was evaluating one of the brigades. I think it was first Brigade of 1st Armored Division, and I met a couple of the counterintelligence agents. Sean Murray was one of them, and I met him because he was standing out front pulling guard on one of the motor pools. I was like, here you got a counterintelligence agent that is in the preparation for him to do his job. He is standing guards in the middle of in the middle of a motor pool, staring at a chain link fence. That's what they had him doing.
This is the nature of the beast, right? So this is less of a criticism and more just a statement of reality. When you're in a counterintelligence unit that has a job in garrison, and then a tasking comes down from some higher, they're like, hey, we need 4 people to go to this field training exercise that really we need to represent and be there, but they don't want us playing the war game with them because we foul things up. So really, we end up playing our own internal war game. So you get 6 people from a unit of 100 people that have nothing better to do or whatever. And so they go. And so really nobody else ever plays I'm deployed war games. And even when we do, it's not reality. We're not linked in, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is every once a quarter, maybe once every 4 months, we would go to the field, right? And so we'd wear our uniforms, we'd run around and put camo on our face and maybe do a military type training thing. Probably not, probably more focused on meets. So out of 100 people, fully a third of them are in some kind of operational support role. And then there's another half of what's left, not a third, but like half, that is in field office formation because they deploy together. They're on teams in theory. And then you have some of us that were going to be role players. And so it's possible to have been there for 2 years and never even done a mock meet with anybody because you just, we couldn't get everybody to fire the 9mm at a range and a thing called range density. There was like, we don't got enough time. And so the same thing with source meets. So people were going in and having a source meet or 2 source meets in 1 week and really with no like critical standard being met. So we really were kind of like playing the game. It was like we're familiar with the concept of running sources, but we really weren't provisioned to really ever train on that. And there was never like a company that showed up and said, we're a bunch of counterintelligence people. We're all going to play roles. And we're going to do intensive 5 roles a day. You're going to get great at this. That never happened.
Right. And that's one of the problems when, you have a large unit that you're supporting and they're doing a training exercise. there's really, all you're doing is you're either writing a script that you're just kind of following, or you're writing, or you're following a script that just says, yeah, and the human side element, because a lot of these training exercises, especially at the large level, they weren't, it wasn't like the old Cold War days where they were just maneuvering all over Germany and wrecking farms and that kind of thing. So they were doing them with computer simulations, and there really isn't a way to infuse the human side of the story with that. And so that's, again, so that's, one of the lessons they learned. And again, we relearned that lesson when the U.S. forces went into Iraq and the whole Abu Ghraib incidents, because you had a group of reservists, and I think the 165th was involved with this then, but that had the problem with the treatment or the mistreatment of prisoners. And that's really one of the shining moments where the Army realizes, like, we deactivated these interrogation units. We really have nobody to run the interrogation side of these cages during an actual war. Yeah. And that's caused the Army, and then affected, they built 3 separate prisoner of war training camps, 2 in Texas, 1 in New Mexico. And there's there's units that go through on a regular basis now, actual new units that they had stood up for interrogation, have pure units to do that with. But in Bosnia, you got to, as we had counterintelligence agents running around the company. Yeah. You had linguists that were part of them, and most of the linguists were reservists that would just happen to know Serbo-Croatian and were tagged over, or partway through or very early on, they sent a reserve company from California that were Russian linguists. Right. And they had to go through a 2-week, they called it a Turbo Serbo course. And they sent these kids, over to us. And when I say kids, these were young soldiers. And a lot of them, beside the fact that they only had 2 weeks of Serbo-Croatian, so that was a tough thing to switch over. But a lot of them were young females, and the bias on the locals that we talked to, especially a police chief or whoever, they simply wouldn't talk to some of them because they were young, pretty blonde females, right? Or they were paying too much attention to them, So all of those factors then blended in. Now add in a bunch of interrogators in the middle of a deactivated company and try to find them a home. Yeah, that's. And then split them up. The entire company was never all together. It was 16 teams, plus the operations section, plus the headquarters section, who were on different base camps. And then midway through the rotation, take the division's 2 counterintelligence team. They called it Team 00. They had gotten in trouble for doing something. I can't remember what they did. It was either spending money or drinking or whatever. Yeah, and then they decided, let's put these guys under parental supervision and send them over to Delta Company. So partway through the deployment, Team 00 shows up, and we have to find a way to integrate them into the operation. So that's kind of what you're dealing with. I've never seen a command run so desegregated as what we did. In fact, when we got everybody together, I made it an intentional plan before we pulled out of country in November of '96. We had been there a lot of guys have been there almost a year. I made it a deliberate plan to make everybody come into my base camp first, and we spent a week there or so. And simply rehearse getting out of country, so nobody got lost, nobody screwed up, nobody got hurt, or killed. And when we got everybody together, there were folks that were introducing themselves to each other for the first time, because I had soldiers that didn't even know each other. Yeah, that was a shock.
And it sounds simple to move an Army unit, put some vehicles on a railhead, put a bunch of them on a bus, and send them north. It is not simple. It is absolutely dangerous to be climbing with gear and equipment and people all over a train. Right. The train's not moving, but it's still it's an unforgiving platform. And so and people do all the time. You fall off of the train, a piece of equipment breaks loose, and whatever it is. So these are things that are slow moving things. You don't rush. The other thing I wanted to say in terms of your command, some of the teams belong to you, and you were like, hey, we're going to shop you out to this unit and you're going to support them, whether they were Swedes, Russians, Poles, Turks, whatever it was. Right. And then some of them did not belong to you at all. And so you could say, hey, team 1, we need you to go. And then their commander would say, get fucked. You're not in charge of this team. My team, they'll do what I tell them to do. And you had to kind of just be like, okay. And so you had you had a command, but not a tactical command over
Right.
a lot of them. And then like our team, we belonged to the company, but we were absorbed by a brigade commander that took us and
Right.
said, no, you're my guys. Right. And
Right.
so again, in effect, he's the battle space owner. And so you had very little control over. Now, we always tried to service both sides, and they were compliant with that. But if you had the right kind of commander and they're like, never even talk to those guys, you would be forced to go dark on the company that you belong to.
Right. I mean, every team had a different relationship with their different commanders on a different base camp. And that was, you know, it was, you know, again, and you had to track all of that, you know, and see, and, you know, and the care and feeding and on all those kind of things. I mean, we had one team, and I think it was yours, that got PNG'd from a base camp because the NCO pissed off the commander. So we had to do, in the middle of the deployment, we had to pick them up, move them to another base camp, because you guys are getting thrown off the base camp, and you know, and move them in. We moved them in with the aviation guys right off of the airfield, and you know, that was right in the middle of everything. You know, we had to send folks out to the Norwegian, Swedish, and Polish brigades, and then the Poles wanted their own team down at their battalion. A lot of folks don't know this. This is just one of the weird things. Is like when we first sent the team there. This is before, and they were there before I took command, but it was a male only team, and so they came back and said, did you know the showers are co-ed up here, you know, at the Nordpol Brigade, and it was in a town called Doughboy, DOBOJ. And then as soon as the first U.S. female showed up, and it was a signal female that they sent, they had to separate the showers and all the, you know, and of course everybody was pissed off about that because, you know, it was deployment, but that was just the kind of life they lived. And we even had, one of our teams had invested into a house that had been, the part of the town had been ethnically cleansed of Muslims. And so this house was owned by a Muslim family who had been killed or eradicated, whatever. And they essentially moved into the house for a year and lived in the house. And it was a cinder block house that was not completely finished. And they brought a bunch of cans of the filler stuff that you just spray into the cracks and fill. That's how they lived. They lived better than any other team that was out there. So that's just the way it is.
So this just illustrates the complexity, not only pre-deployment, but, you know, just we got there and you don't know what to do. And there is no possibility of having a briefing like this is who you're like, we don't know anybody yet. Right. And so one of our jobs was to figure out how to go out and know everybody. And like Erik said, not every unit had the freedom to move around. Like our team could go out every single day, and everybody, we worked the relationship well enough that we had pretty much carte blanche, but we had to earn that. And our Gina Smith was great. Like it's a great story. She deserves me to tell this. I'm going to tell the story real fast. The chemical guys on the camp had no job. And so they were pissed because they got turned into what we'd call duty bodies. Right. And so it was like, you're going to run patrols all day. And by patrols, I mean, like they're going to go drive from A, go to B. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted to do their job, but there was no job. Right. And so they were pissed off because my partner, Greg McGowan, and I were laying out, sunning ourselves, nursing a hangover, but we had also stayed up all night writing reports. And so Gina had given us the morning off, and we were going to go back and go do more work. And so the chemical commander didn't like it. And so during the evening brief, he makes a point to call her out. And she's probably the lowest ranking officer in the room because she's a warrant officer 1, which is probably, other than like a first lieutenant, probably the least respected rank, you know, in a room full of lieutenant colonels, colonels, majors. And she stands up in front of everybody and says, if your guys don't like their job, they should have scored better on the ASVABs. My guys do what I tell them to do. If anybody has a problem, you can come see me. And the colonel who ran the unit looked around and said, does anybody have a problem with Miss Smith's team? And that was it. Everybody knew to shut up because she stood up for us. Right. And she wasn't afraid of that. But as you know, that's not always true in intel.
Yeah, no, it is. And that's the thing. It's like, the personalities. And again, the personalities of each team is different. You've got one warrant officer per team. You have an NCO or 2 NCOs per team, and then you have a specialist or a soldier. And that's a 4-person team. Now, and thing is, in order to get you guys out on the road, you know, one of the bad lessons that we learned from Bosnia, the whole army did, was this hunker base camp mentality, where the commanders were not getting evaluated based upon success of the mission. They were getting evaluated based upon, did they lose any Did anybody get hurt, get killed, or did they lose a major piece of equipment?
Right.
And that was it. Get in country, take as little risk as possible. And so nobody was leaving the base camp. In fact, you couldn't leave a base camp unless you had 4 vehicles as a standard. By exception, we were allowed to leave with only 2 vehicles.
Right.
But you had to have, an automatic weapon. Everybody had to have their body armor on, which was ridiculous body armor compared to today's standards. Right. It was just it was
paper.
All it was a hot vest that you could sleep in a sitting or a standing position. So, but from the standards. But then, and I remember going to the Norwegian and Swedish brigade, and they were kind of razzing me or during the lunch or during a meeting. It says, you guys have to take 4 vehicle convoys everywhere. I said, yeah, and you'll never see a single picture of a U.S. soldier handcuffed to an air defense missile like you guys were.
Right.
And that's which is exactly what happened during the war. The UN peacekeepers who were Swedish or Norwegian, they were handcuffing these guys to air defense sites so that U.S. forces or U.S. Air Force wouldn't blow up those sites. That was a problem, and that's but that was the mentality that we have. Now we took that bad lesson learned into Iraq and the Middle East after 9/11. And so the U.S. forces moved in, took over parts of Iraq, and then hunkered down into base camps and let everything go to hell outside of it. Because the risk factor. It's not until, and I would say this is primarily under General Petraeus that they finally switched that mentality. I think it's 2007. It took how many years are we talking about? 10 years of this bunker mentality that we finally broke that. Mm-hmm. And that was, again, a huge issue. But so from an intelligence standpoint, our agents and interrogators running around country was the only game in town.
I want to get into this in a second.
And I heard that directly from some of the senior leadership of the task force. Says, you guys are the only game in town providing intelligence, all the signal assets and listen.
Well, let's not get ahead. Let's not get ahead because I want to.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I want to illustrate the thing. So you're on a small team, 4, maybe 5 people with your Navy linguist or whatever it is. Right. You still have team maintenance obligations, whether it's maintaining your vehicles or satisfying some need from this command, that command. And so all of that work has to be performed by not very many people, and everybody's got more to do. Right. So it isn't like you have your own support staff. So the E4, like there was this 2-man carry box that had all of our gear in it. And I had to hump all the way across the camp, which sounds like a little bit whiny, but these are enormous camps. So easily a mile in each direction.
Right.
And then there's mud everywhere. And so it's super hard to walk through this mud. And I'm carrying this 2-man carry box on my shoulder across the camp, right? Mm-hmm. So that we can count it, because we don't have time to take all 4 of us to go to some spot and count this thing. So like all these things, and then someone drives over your comms line and you have to trudge out and find all these things are in addition to your mission. And so ideally we're going out every day and we're meeting people we don't know. We're meeting people we do know, and we're in town. But that means you have to write reports and account for everything, the money you spent, who you talked to, and all those things. And that takes hours and hours to write all these reports. And so the pace of operations is just insane. And then like, the company will be great. And you're like, hey, we're upgrading all of the seats to these Recaro seats for the Humvees. Come get your seats and install them in your Humvee. Right. Like, it's like, oh my God, that's like a whole day offline to go pick them up and a whole day to install them. And you don't have the right tools. The tools we have are for changing a tire, and like not like real tools. Anyhow, so what I'm saying is these teams are small, self-sustained, and if they have a good relationship with the commander, there's still a lot more work to do than we could possibly manage. Before we get into us being the main mission, I want to make sure we cover the level of danger, because it turned out the peace held, but we didn't know that at the time. What was the threat assessment for the company, for the battalion?
Part of it, I mean, again, they renamed these teams Force Protection Team. I mean, that was the whole thing, was to identify threats that were coming up. And a lot of it was to talking to the primary job was to go out and meeting with the mayors and the local, even the local military commanders, the chief of police, so that you could get a feel for, are these guys going to go back to war again while we're here? That was the main thrust. And again, there's also, I mean, I still remember watching somebody had confiscated a tank that that one of the local villagers tried to hide, in their backyard. It was an old T-34, T-55, just hunk of junk tank. But again, in a Civil War standpoint, it's a dangerous, obviously a dangerous vehicle. And this guy's got one sitting in his garage trying to hide it. And so there's things like, where you're having to keep that on par. Now we had, and I totally remiss, but I forgot that we also had a group called the Night Owl that I was responsible for. Yeah. The Night Owl was a newspaper that we had printed, and all it was to read the local news so that we could see the opinions on what the Serbs were saying for Serb newspapers, the Croats, the Bosnians. So we hired a bunch of local kids to come into our base camp every day. We paid them triple of what their family had been making in the past. And these kids came in and they just sat and translated papers. Well, one of the problems we had to do was go out into various towns to go pick up more papers. And so we take a linguist with us, and we went way up north into Serb-held territory near us. In fact, it was in a town called Slavonski Brod, which was a part of a disputed region. Even the Dayton Peace Accords, took forever for them to figure out who was responsible or who had control of Slavonski Brod and then the neighboring town Birchko. And we parked our vehicles. We saw a newsstand. I walked out with this kid to go, so he would go pick up the papers, and standing on the corner were several of these purple tiger striped uniformed Serbian soldiers, or Serbian police, but they were paramilitary guerrilla forces, and they were primarily the ones that were responsible for a lot of the atrocities that were taking place in country, the genocides and the ethnic cleansing that was taking place. And so this kid started to visibly shake while we were walking up to this newsstand. And so I grabbed him on his side. I stood right next to him, and I think it was either Ray Duggan or Sergeant Holtzclaw that stood on his other side. And we kind of held him because he was about to faint and collapse. He was so scared and nervous. Yeah, and what we didn't know until later is that his entire family had been ethnically cleansed and kicked out of the town that they were in. And that's why they were living in some apartment in Tuzla, and he thought they were all going to die, or he had some relatives that had been just disappeared overnight. So he was just deathly afraid of these guys. And we got him back in the Humvee. We bought our papers. We sat him back down, and we found that he was so scared that he had urinated all over himself. I mean, that's how it hits home to you that this kid thought he was going to be killed right there, on the spot. And we drive and I remember taking another kid into Doughboy, and we're just driving through the town to get to the Norwegian Swedish base camp. And he just was looking out the window, and I said, "What do you see?" He goes, "I used to live there." And it was an apartment that, they were all cleansed out of, and it was a different kid. It was a different translator that we took with us. And it's just one of these, you talk to these kids on a daily basis, and you don't realize what kind of suffering they had done, and they were only teenagers.
Yeah, we had a kid wet himself during an interrogation because him and his friends were messing around on the edge of camp, because they didn't know any better, right? You'd think they would know better, but they're kids.
Right.
And so he got tangled up, or maybe got pushed into the concertina wire. We don't know this. Well, all we know is that he's there, and it's our job to let him have it, without beating him up around, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And we did. We scared the piss and the shit out of him. He thought he was going to die because that was their world. And once we calmed down, we got a chance to hear his story. It's the same thing, like horrible things that happened, and he was convinced he was going to die. And then, then we told him, "Hey, stay away from the camp. Here's some warm food and everything." But that is the level of fear that these folks lived in, and there were mines everywhere. I mean, we lived in a mine, but still, like, broken ground all over the place. You're like, "Don't go over there, don't go over there." We were worried all the time, and we didn't know if tomorrow would be the day when the fighting would start off again, and we would see echoes of that fighting. We got a chance to go to Sarajevo. For our team was, I think, probably the first team to deliver a vulnerability assessment. Yeah. And because we were first, we did a great job. Right. And they're like, "You guys are the vulnerability assessment team." And they started shopping us all over the place. We went to a mountaintop like you talked about, where it's just, like, it was like, they're like, "Doesn't matter what you write, we're going to be here." We're like, "But this camp is not defendable at all." Right. All these things. So we got to go to Sarajevo to go do a vulnerability assessment. And you could see, like, days before, months before, it wasn't long, there had been a gunfight right where we were standing. There was still, like, broken up concrete on the ground. And so this stuff was really fresh. So when we look back now, historically, it's like, there was no danger. We didn't, as far as a guy on the ground, I didn't know that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was one thing that One thing I took to heart, and I learned this from my older brother, who was a Marine at the Battle of Khafji in the First Gulf War. And his position was overrun by the Iraqi regiment, and he had to hide out in the salt marshes for 12 hours. So he was listed as MIA for a period of time.
Right.
He, one of the things he told me before, he goes, before you go in, make sure that you clean your weapon every other night, just so that you can refocus yourself. It doesn't matter if it was sitting in your holster all day long; you just clean it every night, even if you don't need to. And it's just a way to get your head synced back in, because you're working. Some of the stuff you're doing is just quite honestly was insane. I mean, I was working on PowerPoint slides one night when I was in the S3 shop. I worked it until 1 a.m. Just because the commander was unhappy with them, and I went to bed so tired that the dining facility next to the building I was sleeping in caught fire, and a soldier died. Another one who had been burned beyond act, had to be released from active duty, and the M2 fuel bottles that the cooks were using for their stoves were exploding. Yeah. And we thought we were under a mortar attack. The quick reaction force was deployed. Everybody was awake except for me. I slept through the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I was never more upset about what our priorities should be, when I was like, I slept through what could have been an attack because I was making PowerPoint slides for some commander, the next day or whatever. And that to me hit me very hard of what the priority needed to be.
And you got to keep in mind, like what we're doing, we know nobody and there is no support. My vehicle, it had a physical radio sitting there. It was completely non-operational.
Right.
So one of the two vehicles has no comms, and these are all soft-sided vehicles. We built a fence inside of our Humvee, like we had a high boy Humvee, but that's not really going to stop any rounds. It's a wooden fence. Yeah. And our job was to drive out every day and go find someone we didn't know and meet the next person and look for the most evil people we could find. And again, we don't know when there's going to be a fight. We found this military unit, and while they all did the meeting, I sat in the truck and I counted people, and I'm like 28, 29, 30. I'm trying to take notes, trying to be invisible while I'm sitting in plain sight, because I don't know what's going to happen. So the perception of the threat was very real because it was all around you. And so I wanted to cover that.
Well, we had a terrorist threat in country as well. We were tracking Hamas and Hezbollah. In fact, one of the locations was where the Turkish brigade was down in a factory in the south, and they had occupied this entire factory, and we had actually sent a special forces team that occupied one of the offices in there. It wasn't until they were living there for a few weeks to a few months that they discovered that the opposite end of the factory, essentially the same building, had a Hamas safe house operating out of there. And so that was when the Muslims were fighting the Serbs during the war. Hamas and Hezbollah moved assets into country. They were still there when we were there, and we were only then discovering where these houses were popping up.
One of the other things, and then we're going to get into being the main fight. One of the other things, as you mentioned earlier, it's important to understand this. I mean, I often say like I was a spy, because if you look at how the enemy or how other people see you, you realize that's the operational environment. Yeah, okay, I'm an intelligence collector. I'm a force protection, whatever. It doesn't matter. like I'm going to have to do these things that collect, and I'm wearing a uniform with my name on it, and so you had to figure out how to actually do this stuff in the clear in a way that was natural, so that people would talk to you, because it'd be easy not to talk to us.
Right. Well, I mean, we also had the only approved stash of booze in country. So it was in my tent. I had an entire wall locker full, top to bottom, front to back, with all kinds of hard liquor and cigarettes and Game Boys and stuff like that. Yeah.
Lighters.
To the point where the military police showed up late at night and just said, "Hey, we received a report that you guys are stashing liquor." I was like, "Yeah, you want to see it?" And I opened it up, and it's like, and here's the receipt for it.
Yeah.
And they just had no idea what we did on that base camp, and so that was the thing that we had to deal with on every camp. You had to deal with why you guys have bottles of alcohol. It's like, we're not drinking it. It's for the mayors, and it's for the police chiefs and the newspaper editors.
Maybe you guys weren't drinking it, but we had to drink it.
I got you. Right. You had to drink it with them. No, I understand.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. And then why are you guys leaving camp? And then we did foot patrols in the area all the time, right? Because there was no limitation there, and so we were going, and if we'd ever gotten to a firefight, it would have been over. We had no ability to defend ourselves,
No, and that was one of the monikers, or one of the standing orders was nobody in the task force would ever lose a tactical fight. Well, that's impossible. That was totally up to the Bosnians and the Serbs.
Yeah,
whether that would,
3 people with 9mm on our team,
right?
And then
exactly.
Greg and I had, and then if you lost a bullet, oh my God, into your life,
Right.
This is the only deployment in history I've kind of looked around that I can find. This is American history, where there's like a massive multinational force, and it is a intelligence unit that is the tip of the spear. It's not the SEALs, it's not tanks, it's not infantry.
Nope.
It's counterintelligence and interrogator folks.
Absolutely. In fact, one our operations teams under Lieutenant Dan Hansen, he was working behind the White House, which was the division headquarters on Tuzla Air Base. It was him in one. It was a very small building, again, cinder block, very rustic. First office was the G2X, which was the divisional planners for CI and human activity. But the company's counterintelligence operations was right next to him, and then the next office over was the human analysis cell, and it was a team that we had pulled out of the field. It wasn't really part of our organization. We just designated the team. You guys are going to be doing analysis full time.
Yeah.
That was, again, it was the only game in town of what was going on. We had some UAV folks. Again, they were flying around half of the time. They were lawn darting. I think that operation, again, they used the Pioneer, which was a U.S. version of an Israeli UAV, which was, again, one of the first military UAVs. That operation was, this was in the opinion of the Marines. They said, we're here to show the failure of this thing so we can get funding to move from the Pioneer to the Predator, which was still not really deployed. It was still an experimental weapon system then.
Right.
And so that's that's all the Pioneer did. And we had to send teams out every time that thing lawn darted to find out where it went
all the time.
and who who did it hurt anybody or anything like that. So,
right. And it was funny because we could hear it take off. Because those Marines, we were like their stepbrother, right? Like, so we were from the company, and so we were their like immediate point person, and so we had a pretty good relation. We would take them out on missions with us, but you hear that rocket go off with, whoosh, and we're like, how long until it crashes? Because it was gonna crash almost every single time, It is important, and I want to tease this and get into it in a little bit, but this was I'm calling it the dawn of the digital age for intel people,
Right.
So we'll get into that. There were some interesting things that happened. We had a guy that left the army and came back to Bosnia to meet up with his Bosnian girlfriend, who he was going to marry, and he was hanging around the camp. And we got called. This is exactly why you call counterintelligence folks. We're like, hey, well, we don't care if you've got a Bosnian girlfriend, but if you come around here, we're going to assume you have bad intent. You don't get to hang. I know those are your friends, but you don't get to hang out here anymore. Don't come back. You know, we love you. Don't come back.
We had an issue where a Japanese tourist, again, Americans were not supposed to be in country. There were not supposed to be any American tourists. So this kid getting in there was a total mistake. But we had a Japanese tourist that was out front of one of the northern base camps, and he was taking photos of the front gate, as a tourist would.
Yes.
Well, they came out, grabbed him, brought him into the camp, and they were going to interrogate him. Well, we had a Japanese linguist as an interrogator. I don't know if you know this. His name was Chaz Owen.
Oh, right.
So
Okay.
We were getting ready to send Chaz up there to do his interrogation. He was all pumped for it, and then we got a call that
Roger,
it's God, it's all gnarly. But he was ready to go, and then we get a call that they had a Japanese-born lieutenant that was a platoon leader or something like that at the base camp as an infantry guy, and they decided they were just going to use this guy to do it. Well, turns out they stripped him down and hogtied him. They just did all these stupid things that were just total violation of this guy's rights. And again, and that was the memo that came out afterwards is let the professionals do this kind of thing for tactical questioning. And it was just like one of those embarrassing things. Like, why do you guys, God, we had guys right there to do this for you. You didn't need to,
this is a common thing. Like, Alan West did this. He decided to interrogate an Iraqi and fired a gun right by his head and everything. Yeah. And he didn't officially do anything criminal because they didn't convict him. Right. But that's criminal. You and I know that. And it's very common for them to say everybody's an intel collector. Yeah. That's great. Now back up and let me do my job,
Right.
So talk about the Spetsnaz guy, because this is also an interesting story.
Oh yeah, we had all throughout our deployment, we had individual soldiers that would show up to our company and say, all right, I'm here to help. And a lot of them, they called them TCSers, temporary change of station, where they were just assigned, pulled out from whatever unit they were. And so we had one guy show up, and I'm just going to call him Specialist K because I don't want to dox this guy.
Mm-hmm.
He was an infantry specialist. And as soon as he showed up on our base camp, my agent started looking at this guy and looking at him sideways. It's like, we've seen this guy before. And I finally sat him down. It's like, hey, tell me about your background, because he was an old guy for an infantry specialist. And he goes, actually, I'm a defected Spetsnaz lieutenant from the Soviet army.
Yeah.
He wasn't Soviet. He was Ukrainian. But he was in Germany during the height of the 80s, and his job in Germany was to cache explosives in different parts or near and around Munich to blow up bridges. So in case the Soviets ever did invade, he was already pre-positioned to do that. Well, he defected right there in Munich, and the 66 MI was there. There's a lot of counterintelligence guys in Augsburg. So a lot of these guys knew him. In fact, the guy's like, hey, is that Specialist K? And it's like, yeah. He goes, I know his handler. He's a friend of mine. So everybody knew about this guy before he showed up. And so a lieutenant in the Soviet army, only equated to a specialist in the U.S. Army. And so, I asked this guy, I was like, hey, how long have you been in country? And he goes, what, this tour? I was like, how many tours have you done? He goes, this is my 6th tour.
Wow.
I did 5 with the Soviet army.
Right.
So he had been in country forever. Well, we put him on a team, and then we sent him out with our LURS guys, because the LURS mission, oh gosh, talk about a company that was a wasted asset. Their whole job was to form a convoy and drive down to the mass grave sites near Srebrenica and Garage and a couple other places in the south, and make sure that nobody had tried to dig up or hide evidence of these mass grave sites. That was their job every day. So we started sending him out with them. But it turned out that, somebody up the chain found out that we had a Spetsnaz defector in our group. Our brigade commander found out. So he decided, and he would go every so often, he'd grab me and say, hey, I want to go on a tour for your teams. And so we go on a tour. It'd be an all-nighter or 2-nighter, whatever. We would just drive around country. Twice during those, I had to walk him out of a minefield because he had his driver drive into, did you not see those signs with the skull and crossbones?
Yeah.
His mine, and everything. I remember doing it in the middle of the night.
I know the word mine in almost every language.
Right. I'm still picturing myself trying to use a flashlight to walk through the tire treads of where they had driven, so nobody had gotten blown up. We did it twice. And so he decided he was going to take on one of these tours, and we went and saw the different teams and different battalions. Of course, he had to do his command visits and everything. He says, well, I want to go to the Russian brigade. And the Russian brigade was in the northeast, and primarily in a Serbian zone, because the Russians and the Serbs were more ethnically aligned. And so the U.S. part of the Russian base camp was separated by a river. And so the U.S. had a very small enclave to keep themselves separate from the Russians. And so he decides, well, I'm going to bring this guy. I said, sir, you can't bring this guy over there. He is a known, defector. Yeah. And so we show up, the very first checkpoint. There's a Russian lieutenant and a couple of soldiers standing at this checkpoint. They start talking to us, and I see this guy look at Krabichenko, and I see him lock up in terms of he becomes very stiff, and and they're speaking Russian to each other and that kind of thing. And so we walk back to the Hummer and back to our Hummers to drive the rest of the way into the base camp. And I go, they fingered you, didn't they? He goes, there's a picture of me in the guardhouse.
Oh my God.
And he's like, so they had been actively looking for him. So
right.
and I finally persuaded the commanders, like, do not walk into the headquarters with this guy. Let me keep him over here on this side of the river. There's a little suspension bridge between the two. I said, you take him over there. They could take him right on the spot and say he's ours. And all of a sudden you've created an international incident.
Yeah, you get into a gunfight over this guy? Is that what you're going to do?
Right. And so we kept him in the tent. We kept him under wraps. He knew, he was shaking his head because he knew it was going to be bad. We get back to base camp. 11:30 that evening, we get a call at our company CP. So, and it's from the division chief of staff. And he said the division commander had been called directly by the Russian brigade commander. The Russian brigade commander told Major General Nash that he can't confirm or deny that he has his own Spetsnaz in country, but if he did, they know he sleeps on Steel Castle Base Camp in this tent on this rack. He knows exactly where this guy is. And so there we were at one in the morning, putting a convoy together, sneaking this guy back to Tuzla Airfield and putting him on a plane. And at 3 something in the morning, we flew out and we never saw him again.
Yeah.
I mean, we lost that asset instantly because we thought he was, and the thing is even driving to the base camp, we had never been more alert. We weren't afraid at that point of much of the, we would have advance warning that the Bosnians or the Serbs would build up forces to start fighting again. We had no idea whether we would get ambushed by Russian Spetsnaz on the way to the airport. I mean, even though they're quote unquote our allies, this guy was still on the rolls. And so that we didn't know that what was going to happen. So that was probably the most dangerous night in country, worrying about this guy, whether he was going to live the night or not and get out.
And this just to show what a different time this was. Russians were deployed with Americans on a NATO international peacekeeping force. Like this is it's a crazy thing. This is not bananas. And if they chose to, walk across that river and use force to take that guy, even if they didn't fire a shot, as far as I understand the row, you wouldn't be able to shoot back. You'd have to just wait until there was an actual fight.
Oh, they would have taken him.
Yeah,
I mean, they would have vastly overpowered us in firepower. So there's only a handful of Americans on that side. I mean, it was just one of those things. It's like why do we even create these kind of
why go near the Russian? There were so many other areas where he could have gone and helped out.
Well, the thing is they like I said, they suspected he was in country. And so as soon as he showed up, it was like having a celebrity show up because everybody was, the watchword was look for this guy.
Yeah.
So, and what do? We bring him to their front porch. So.
Yeah. Way to go, headquarters. One of the things that I wanted to get into was like people don't understand what spies are. Like I get asked, like, are you like Jason Bourne? Are you like, Ethan Hunt or whatever? And in some ways, okay, sure, we are. But really, those characters are like many people put together. I don't do my own analysis. I don't do my own ops. I go out, I gather information. Someone else processes it. I may do my own internal simple analysis. Yeah. But that's just for day to day to guide me where to go, right? So let's talk about what it is. Like, what is Muddy Boot collection?
This is why I really have a hard time watching any Hollywood movie about spies. Yeah. Especially Mission Impossible or something like that, where you're just God Lord, Enemy of the State with Will Smith and I think it was Gina. It's just they're just so over the top ridiculous and. For Muddy Boot Spies, like essentially we were soldier spies. Yeah. That was our purview. Of course, there were other assets in country. We all knew that. I mean, that's the thing is we kind of did our thing. We deliberately actually tried to avoid having contact with them just because of what they were doing. But again, it was an only game in town. It wasn't until I think 3 or 4 years ago, I was actually at the Spy Museum and I met somebody from another agency who was in country, who was at Tuzla, who was living on the economy with her then husband and was talking about her thing. It's like, I wasn't 2 miles from you the entire time for 9 months. Right. And I'm only now meeting this person. So it was just, it was one of those things. So we were in uniform, we were wearing, battle dress uniform, the camouflage, we were carrying weapons. It was in fact, the patch we had, the fleur de lis. In fact, it's behind me. Oh, sorry, it's behind me to the on the wall. It's the blue patch with the white fleur de lis. As soon as somebody saw that patch, you knew most likely that person was a soldier spy. Yeah, because that was the unit. And so, and I know we had, I don't want to get into the problems we had because I had a couple of our teams were removing their patches and putting somebody else's on. And one of our warrant officers decided, well, if I'm going to remove the patch, let me change my rank, and he made himself a first lieutenant. Yeah. And it's like, wait a minute, there's that, and then there's, you not working a cover support plan to and have that signed off. Right now, you're just impersonating an officer, which is illegal as it is. So
we actually have the legal right to do these things, but it's within an organized plan.
It's a very controlled thing.
Yeah.
So, but that's what, again, you can say, yeah, we're spies, but you're a spy for an army unit. You're not a spy for the president or for a national agency. What was interesting about a lot of the reports that we had sent up, we would get those back from a national agency as a report to tell us what was going on in country. And I'm going through this list, with Joe Garland, and he's working in the back, and he's always calling me boss. But the one of the things he goes, see this report we just got from this 3-letter agency? He goes, yeah, I wrote that. they're trying to tell me what's going on in country, and I'm the one who's writing half of this report that they're telling me. So it was just this circular thing that, again, it's just revalidation. It's like, look, we're the only thing that's going on here.
Mm-hmm. So. This is another illustration of that. Was so we're in this industrial complex. It's a mine. There's some buildings. There's these giant Tonka trucks. These things are as big as a house, and they literally almost crushed a Humvee one day. So this is a massive industrial space. And there was also a rocket launcher. The rails didn't move; they were fixed, and they were pointed at one of the buildings. That there was nowhere for the rocket to go. The rockets would have they could go into the building, but this building was not occupied and everything else. And so we had found that early on, and then I kind of crawled into the manhole, and then I started snipping wires so that you couldn't control anything with your thumbs. But every 6 weeks, 4 weeks, someone would be like, "Oh my God!" And the thing was, is this thing couldn't move. It had no engine,
right.
And so it was completely non-operational. And we couldn't find any kind of rockets anywhere. And it was like basically on our camp. It was literally like you could look. I'm in a room that's maybe 20 feet long. It was right there. It was like we had constant eyes on it.
Right.
So it wasn't a threat, but it was constantly being discovered. Even though we had written the report, it was like, oh my God, there's this rocket launcher. And so I'd have to go, and then I'd have to do my due diligence. I'd have to crawl into the manhole and be like, nope, this thing is. It did have power, by the way. When I snipped the lines, they were hot.
Wow.
But I snipped them so many times, so many ways you'd have to rewire it, and I would notice it. But that was like one of the things where everybody kept discovering these things. We had the area so wired for that kind of stuff that there was never anything new that anybody brought externally.
And 3 months later, they probably think there's 12 rockets there because 12 different people reported it. So
yeah. The red car. You're like looking for the red car. You're like, well, I saw a white car. Like, it could be that. You're like, okay, let's calm down.
Yeah.
One of the things is you guys had an analysis cell. You had all these teams, and as screwed up as we were with our training and our lack of preparation, because this is all new stuff, it did seem to me like we produced, I don't know, a report a day, something like that was answering questions, and it was a constant churn of information that you guys had to read. So it wasn't like we were good at what we did, and that part worked. At least as far as I could see on the team, because I knew we were pushing reports out. My other friends, if I got a chance to talk to them, like, we're so busy pushing. Like John Murray's team was writing things all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the things is, and then draw that in contrast with how the Russians are performing now in Ukraine. We had small unit leadership, and that's part of just the strength of the U.S. Army. You have an awesome NCO. We had warrant officers that were working, with each team. A lot of. I still forget that we never had any platoon leaders. We were authorized 2 platoon leaders for the company, and we didn't have any. And so my platoon leaders were NCOs, and Holtzclaw and Duggan. And I had an XO who then switched out later on, and then we had an ops officer with a team of guys. But that we were missing these extra lieutenants that we probably could have put to great use. But again, that didn't really affect us. We really, did it's because each team could operate independently. Each team did well. So what my primary job was really, was day to day was just making sure you guys had the freedom and the resources available and cleaning up any problems that were created, so that you could just do your job. On a day-to-day basis. I never had to, if I was a micromanager, it would have been a complete failure of everything. It was the complete opposite of what was required. It was very, again, a very desegregated thing. The only thing when I really had to start putting, the entire company's orchestrated movements together was when we had to leave, and we had to do it as a single unit.
Right.
And that was difficult, but it wasn't, again, all these independent teams, everybody was good to go. It wasn't like we had any problems throughout the whole country with just basic lack of leadership.
When you when we were talking earlier, and I said we were going to talk about this later on, this was really the dawn of the digital age. Maybe we want to call it something else, but for the generation or two ahead of us, the senior command, they'd never seen a laptop. I mean, word processors were a thing like 2 or 3 years before this deployment. You could still find them out and about. Now we have laptops, we have digital cameras,
right?
We have portable printer scanners, right? We can carry this stuff in a suitcase, which sounds super secret agenty. These were not very secrety things,
right?
But we could pull a hard drive out of a computer. We could email a report. Before this, it was paper, it was pencil, it was envelopes that were taped and all kinds of special things to courier a report to you guys, or a tactical fax.
Right.
You're like, oh, it's raining, can't do a tactical fax, jump in that Humvee and take it to headquarters, right? And that was, if we had deployed 18 months earlier, that might have been the case where the digital age wouldn't have been positive enough that we could have deployed in that way.
Right. Now, granted, these laptops were, I think, 386s, and they were Windows 3.1 or something like that we were operating off. I mean, they, from today's standards, they're about the strength of a light bulb. But but we had that. We did have digital cameras. We did have actually we had some covert cameras where we were putting them within first aid pouches, and so you couldn't, the button on whatever. And that's, so if there was a demonstration going on or something, and there were, especially down with the Poles, had some problems. We were taking pictures of the instigators. We were running those against, we didn't have anything in terms of biometrics. That was not even a real, a science that could be even usable at that time. But so what were a lot of these print, like the laptops and everything? I still remember having somebody working on PowerPoint slides and printing them off for one of our commanders in the Humvee while he's traveling to a briefing, because the previous day's work of making PowerPoint slides wasn't good enough. I mean, it was just one of those ridiculous things. And it was because that the Corps Commander, General Abrams, the son of Creighton Abrams, was visiting. And, and everybody had to have their briefing for what they were doing. And I can remember just how ridiculous it was, is that we were still using 3.5-inch discs. And one of the PowerPoint slides that I was working was too large for a single 3.5-inch disc. So in order to transport it anywhere, we had to separate the graphics into separate slots. I mean, it was just such an archaic thing, but that's the start of when the Army started going PowerPoint heavy. And we were no longer reading anything. We started doing it. And the joke was, if it's not on a PowerPoint slide, it's not allowed to happen.
Right.
So, that was that whole airlift plan, that the entire recon effort. I mean, we were driving up into Croatia looking at runways of if we wanted to build one here or there. And I had a couple teams in Croatia near the end. We had to make PowerPoint slides off of every place we went to, all the digital photos we took of the landing strip and everything else. And I'll tell you, the Croatian one was a sweet place, but they finally decided, let's put it in the middle of this god awful quarry where you guys were living. So we built the runway there. So
the one of the things too, like the laptop early on had this feature where you could detach it and turn it around. And then show the person, right? And we did that. And Sergeant Dachka, he was great. He was, in one part, he was a menace. And I would tell, like, the people I worked with on camp, if you see him and he's yelling at me, that's just how he talks.
Right.
Like, he's just a very hard to get along with person. But he also, and I don't know why, and this is like how we'll close, it worked. He said, you and Greg are the main guys. You are going to go out. You're going to collect every day. Tell me where you want to go. I'll check your plan. We'll go out there, and I'll make sure you guys don't get into too much trouble. But I want you pushing hard every day and writing reports every day. And it's like, report, not good enough. Report, not. And so we learned how to ask questions. We learned how to run operations. We learned how to go out and get into an area and get all these things done. We back to the digital thing. We had to unplug our hard drive every night and put it into our safe.
Right.
Because it was a
pull it out from the back of the laptop. Right.
Pull it out. Right. So but he freaked out when we spun because he didn't know that laptop had that capability, because he wasn't there that day for training. He was probably doing something with his family to get ready to go.
Right.
But all that stuff would amaze people who were anything more than a captain. They'd be like, "What in the fuck? You printed this thing in your car?" We're like,
right.
yes, and that did buy some credentials. Like we when we would brief, whoever we were with, and we blow them away with stupid PowerPoint, like because I could imitate a concertina fence in PowerPoint. They were like, "This is magic,"
That's slick stuff, man.
Yeah. Okay, so I got you on leadership, but why did this work? Why were we able to go into this completely new space in this completely new age and pull off what we pulled off? And could we have done better, do you think?
I don't think we could have. And the thing is the reason why the CI and the HUMIT operations did well is because it is close to the wartime mission that the unit trained to all the time. For the field artillery and the infantry guys, I mean, good Lord, I mean, the infantry guys didn't do anything close. My wife sent me I was a Simpsons fan at the time, so she sent me a VHS full of the first and second seasons. I mean, it was like 12 hours of Simpsons just to keep me entertained. She just mailed it to me, and the Lurks guys found out I had it, so they asked me, "Hey, can we borrow this?" It's like, "Yeah, sure. Just bring it back when you're done watching them all." And next morning they bring it back. I say, "No, just keep it until you're done." They're like, "No, we're done."
Yeah, we're done. We watched them all.
You guys watched 12 hours of videos over 12 hours. That's how busy they were. They just weren't, they weren't doing anything. And so, you got to feel for the artillery folks. They weren't doing anything. And like, how long can you just sit and maintain your vehicles and not get anything else done?
Yeah.
So, I mean, so there's, but for the CI and HUMIT folks, and there's some other folks, the public affairs, the engineers, the guys who were building roads. I mean, they were doing that's what they did. So that's was close. So we were doing that mission. It wasn't off. I mean, the tough part is you can't train for it in a peacetime environment, but in a wartime environment, it's very similar. And that's another reason for the success of what we had done.
One of the things we learned operationally, and I know this is an independent discovery across the board for all the teams, but we learned to partner with PSYOPs. We learned to partner with civil affairs because they had access, but not enough stuff. And we had access, but not enough stuff. So we could partner and support their mission or split our mission or whatever it was going to be. Yeah. But that enabled us to get out and stretch a little further out because we kind of had our area wired tight, Yep. And the other thing I wanted to say, this is I think interesting, and I want to hear what you saw as a commander. It wasn't okay. Look, the whiskey was great. Being able to drink Slivovitz and all that stuff was great. But it wasn't the money. It wasn't the booze. It wasn't the lighters or the Game Boys. It was the things that they couldn't get that we had in spades. Sunscreen was the big thing for us that got us introduced to the next guy. We ran this whole operation for Easter. We threw a party in part because we wanted to go meet the guy who was the farmer in this area. And so we're like, hey, how do we get this guy to buy a bunch of pigs so he can be nice to us? And so the officers in this medical battalion put together over $250 or whatever it was. And we put on this pig roast, but that guy introduced us to somebody else. And so it was stuff like this. We're like, how do I help this person? A lighter, great. Maybe I'll make their friend, make him into a friend. And it wasn't like ideology like we were taught. It was like, no, this person's in desperate need of this one thing.
Right. And some of it was status driven. I mean, that near the end of the deployment, the biggest thing that became more popular, and we started ordering it as fast as we could get our hands on it, was coffee. And Starbucks coffee, because all these wild blends were coming out, and so we were trying to order it as fast as we can. It was only at the end of the deployment that we had figured that Starbucks was coming. Again, before 96, 95, Starbucks wasn't really a big deal, and so that was a big deal. And to give a bag, we weren't just like serving them coffee; we were just giving them whole bags of whatever mountain blend or whatever coffee to the local and. That was more important to some of them than because they had already had a year full of somebody giving them Jack Daniels and American whiskey and that kind of thing. That was a step up to them. Any kind of a bourbon from the crap vodka that was good Lord. Yeah. When I was in
all
Ukraine,
of our guys.
I was buying bottles of vodka for $2 a bottle from an old woman who was using the wing of a MiG-29 as shade.
Oh my God!
That was in the western part of Ukraine that they had that the Russians then attacked a couple weeks ago. But that was just oh God, we drank it for lunch with these guys. It was just horrible. So when we brought in this great American bourbon, that was a big deal. But after a year of it, it was like, okay, now you guys got this really great coffee. We want our hands on that as well.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's all good.
Yeah, those were definitely interesting things. We bought our one of our families that we had met along the way and kind of continue to maintain relationship. We bought them an automatic coffee grinder,
Oh,
that kind,
right.
and they're like, we like it the old fashioned way, hand
Yep.
grind it, you know.
Yeah.
But you made family while you did this with the
Yep.
hand grinder, and it took forever to grind the crap up. But that's what that was the thing they never taught us, was like, how do you do these cultural things, right? They taught us how to not offend people and that kind of thing, but that's not any valuable. What's valuable is how do they do it, and then learning that with them in real time. That connected us.
Well, we made the mistake of buying, I don't know who it was very early on. I think it was, I'm going to blame Randy Narmy for this, but the he had a sign that he was the senior human intelligence technician or the shit on his door, but he bought a bunch of Game Boys.
Yeah.
And it's like, we were supposed to hand these Game Boys out, but they took, AA or AAA batteries. Like, where are these kids going to get new batteries?
They didn't have that. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's like, this is, why would we even do this? You're just going to tick off a 7-year-old, and he's not going to give you any information anyways that's accurate. You got to go to the adults in the country.
You got to go to the adults to find the bad guys.
Exactly.
Yeah. You might get started with the kid, but you don't need to give him a Game Boy for that.
No.
We picked up our load of booze one time. We were like, so we hopped into the patrol. They were going to Lukovac, jumped a bunch of us off to do some business for a while. They'd come back an hour later, and the commander went to his brief. Or no, the commander had a brief there, but his driver in the patrol took off and went somewhere else. Well, I took my supply, put it into the commander's Humvee, and because it was protected, right? It was a hardened Humvee. Everybody else's Humvees were soft-sided with no locks.
Right.
And so Sergeant Beebe was the guy's name. He took off driving, and all the roads are shit and everything, and the box falls over, and booze goes everywhere. And he's like, "Hey, Pete, your box, it opened and fell over." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. Did anything break or spill or anything?" And he's like, No, that's okay." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." And he's like, "It's full of booze." And I'm like, "I know." And he's like, "I won't tell anybody." And I'm like, "Good. It's classified. You can't tell anybody." That was great. But, these are the weird things that happen along the way. Like, you get those stupid Game Boys, and mostly we drank their booze, their beer and everything. We would often give them money for that stuff, but there was a lot of drinking, a lot of drinking.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I caught, not caught, but we had to send, I'm trying to remember his name, but we had to send a guy over to Croatia for a piece to link up with the French. And he was out right on the coast, and he was in a resorts where they were having weddings and everything. And he was the first sergeant for HHS. I can't remember, his name is totally slipping my mind. But he showed me pictures, and there's a picture of him injecting alcohol into a watermelon. That's like, hey, what was going on here? He's like, oh, it was a wedding.
Yeah.
That's just the way.
Yeah. Well, okay. So we know we did a good job collecting. We grabbed a lot of information. It's stuff that nobody else had the capability to get. So good on us for doing it. What else do you want to say in closing? What else about this fight makes it unique? Why is Delta Company worthy of having a book written about it?
I tell you, for me personally, that was one of that had to be the hardest job I had in the military. I mean, every other job after that and before that, there were some difficult ones, but that one was the toughest part, because there's so many operating, so many balls that were in the air that we had to operate on a daily basis, and then just the life or death consequences of screwing something up. And that was a huge, it weighs on your mind. And I can see how, post-traumatic effects of losing soldiers in combat, how that would be a thing. I mean, we just lost a guy that I had known. He was a retired major general that ended his own life a few months ago. And part of what he said in his retirement speech is he named off every soldier that had ever died under his command. And the thing is that kind of traumatic stress, I felt maybe a fraction of what this guy felt. And it's just a tragedy, but you feel what that's like.
Yeah.
And you can't separate that. I mean, the thing is what's great about, but toughness then also bonds folks together. So there's folks, I will still go, if I ever get a chance to go to Sierra Vista, Arizona, or Fort Huachuca, and I can go visit Chazo, and I'll go visit them. I mean, I will go out of my way, even some of the cold cases that we're working now. I called Gina Smith and asked for her help on one of these cold cases. And she said, look, I'm retired. I'm making furniture now. And it's just not my life anymore. But I appreciate it. It's like we really needed somebody to do some questioning of one of these suspects. That we're looking at. But that's but it was nothing for me to call her up after 26 years of not talking to her. And if you guys hadn't got thrown off that one base camp, she would never have met her husband.
I know, it's crazy.
So you think about that. So somebody causing problems on one base camp got her and her, started her whole family.
Yeah.
And so
crazy.
I even though she's my age or older, I probably felt like I was being protective of her when this guy was calling our CPs, asking for Gina Smith, and I was like, who is this? Who is this boy who's calling you? So it's like, you feel that kind of closeness. And so I have, there's guys that we were deployed with together, even who you don't know, they're going to be your lifelong friends. You just shared something with them that you just can't replicate in any other part of society.
The stress of combat, we look at like our version of it and everything else. And again, in retrospect, wasn't dangerous, but you don't know that at the time. So one of the things I got to do was go up in the Black Hawk and lean out the side of it and take aerial photos because I had this digital camera. And I love that kind of stuff,
Right.
And so we're out, and I don't even know where we were, but it was like an episode of Magnum PI where the warrant officer and the captain are like, this is my mission. Like they're like, they tasked this air out for me to go out and take shots.
Right.
And they're like, hey, Specialist Turner, the helicopter's broken. We're going to land. And so they land in the field. And so we're like, can we walk around in this field? We had no idea.
Yeah, you don't know. Right.
Yeah. And so we're like, we think we can, but you don't know, And so we kind of walk around because it wasn't like freshly turned up. So whatever was there, and it looked like cows had been there. So we made a good guess. And so we kind of stood there. We ate some lunch. Laid out in the sun. Well, these guys tried to sort out what we were going to do. Were they going to get a replacement? What were we going to do? And finally, they're like, "Hey," and keep in mind, like there's a captain and there's like the W4, right? Yeah. Like, and then there's me, and then like their assistant. Right. This is my mission. So they come to me. They're like, "Hey, Specialist Turner, the helicopter's broken. We're going to take it back to camp. Should be no problem, but we're going to drop you off. And this is all unexpected because we were going to be on for like 6 hours or whatever it was."
Right.
And so you're like, I'm like, Roger, go ahead. Because they had to approve it with me or something. Yeah. And so they dropped me off on the helipad, which was half a mile away from our camp. And then they got to go because this thing is breaking. Like you can hear it making bad noises. They're going to get back safe. But they're not going to wait around.
Right.
And I have no radio. I have no comms.
Right.
And nobody's expecting me.
Yep.
And so now I'm there and I'm one man patrolling it. And there's some kids that come running up and I'm like, okay, at least there's kids here. I know that I can walk on this road and it should be safe, but I don't know that. And so I'm walking and I'm like, am I going to get shot? Am I going to be the butcher of, whatever, the camp, Angela or whatever, and have to shoot all these kids? And then I realized, holy shit, I'm approaching an American camp, unexpected, in an Army uniform. I have no idea what the password of the day is.
Right.
And it was terrifying the entire way until I got there and they're like, oh, that's Pete. Hey, Pete, But partly because I knew everybody and everybody knew me, I was able to walk up. But that doesn't mean it wasn't fucking terrifying the entire time.
Right. You don't want it running through your mind and after there's going to be a report filed later on and somewhere in there is written, and that's the last anybody saw of him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or he shot 20 kids, because a goat came out of it, whatever.
As it got colder and it got into November, just before we redeployed, the minefield outside of our base camp started going off. At night. And so you'd hear them it wouldn't be all the time, but it'd be like once a week or so. You'd hear one go. Of course, you're woken up, and it's just a reminder. It's like, still, you're in your rack. It's like, are we under attack? No, it's the mines again. Just that kind of thing.
Right. Anything you want to ask me before we go?
No, I mean we're covering it. There are so many pieces of what went on during that entire year, and even in subsequent deployments like Iraq and Afghanistan, this was such a unique mission for what we did, and now again I'm watching the news now, and there's stories coming out that this conflict may get hot again. I'm already seeing stories that there's already problems that are popping back up, and so that was part of the thing. And we thought it was like, are we just halftime before they go at it again? And I remember it was CNN or whoever interviewing somebody going into Kosovo, which is a similar operation that went in 3 years later.
Right.
And they're interviewing this Marine. He's like, well, no, how long you been here? And the guy's like, well, I've been here about 3 weeks. He goes, well, how long do you think you're going to be here? I said, well, we'll be here about 40 years.
Yeah. 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 Remember when
very pessimistic, but
when the deployment first happened, they're like, President Clinton has 90 days approval to deploy these forces. And we all knew it was bullshit from the beginning.
Yeah.
We signed a damn 30-year lease for Tuzla, and I believe re-upped that since then. So.
It was election night '96 where we had just crossed the border from Bosnia into Croatia, and we got the word that Clinton had been reelected, and of course we knew it. Said, well, then these guys are never going to leave. I mean, that was part of the thing. Is like, we're only going to be there for a short time. It's like, no. We're in country, and I can tell you we're not leaving. So,
yeah. All right. Well, let me shut this thing down. Stand by for a sec while I do.
Cool. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yes, that was great.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for